record. Sydnee, hello, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. It's lovely to see you.
It's lovely to see you as well.
Thank you very much. So we are starting our videos by asking our participants just to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about their work. Would you mind doing that?
Absolutely. I'm Sydnee Wagner. I have a PhD in English from the Graduate Center CUNY in early modern English specifically, and I study the racial ideologies and racial epistemologies of the early modern period, meaning I study the ideas of race and how the concept of race was incepted or created.
Yeah, thank you. For people who are unfamiliar with the word epistemologies, do you mind specifically unpacking that a little bit? What are racial epistemologies?
So the way in which race was formed in the period, the ideas of race and specifically racism was formed. So kind of going through the early modern period as not the starting point, because I do respect the scholars of like medieval and classical race studies, but to kind of think how were sovereign forms of racism created. So the way in which England formed a national identity through race, and how that impacted things like the transatlantic slave trade and colonial projects.
Great, thank you. I suppose this is part of a wider historicization of race and racism, which is, it feels like the kind of popular image of racism is that it's either a very recent thing or it's a very long-term thing, and neither of those quite work, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, you're helping us think about what's distinctive to the early modern period in that sense of sovereign forms of racism. Mm-hmm. That's a really great phrase. Do you mind unpacking that? What does it mean to claim sovereignty in the name of race?
So my specific work is on the figure of the gypsy and the population of Romani people in early modern England, and how race and nationalism developed around this figure through fiction, but also through the realities of Romani people. So I use the word sovereign biopolitics in my work, which means that sovereignty or sovereign power was created against or with the violence against Romani bodies. So there were multiple legislations in the period called Egyptian Acts that called for the punishment and often the execution of Romani people. And these punishments came in the forms of whippings, brandings, and mutilations as a way to mark them. And then execution being the kind of final act of violence. And so thinking through these violences, both in the court cases that I attend to and also the fictional representations I attend to, I think through the way in which the early modern sovereign, whoever that may be, Elizabeth or James, and how they're shaping and reshaping constantly their notion of sovereign power through these violent acts against people of color, and how that becomes a testing ground for colonial acts of genocide against Indigenous people.
So thank you. So we're talking here specifically about English and later 16th century and earlier 17th century legalized acts of violence.
Mm-hmm.
I got that right.
Yeah.
And in your final point there, what's happening in England in turn then produces how race and otherness is being dealt with by the English when they are themselves abroad.
Yes, absolutely. I do think that there's a way in which sovereign biopolitics is not always, because we can think about the transatlantic slave trade as another form of biopolitics that relies on bare labor versus bare life, if you're interested in biopolitics. So they wanted to keep enslaved Black Africans alive because it was, not just about capital, but about creating kind of sovereign power, and also a way in which white people imagined their own whiteness by being able to buy slaves. So that space in itself was created to bolster sovereign power. But then thinking about genocidal biopolitics, so the act of murdering people of color, and the violences against people of color's bodies, that genocidal biopolitics is something that I attend to, starting with a testing ground of, you can push it back later than Romani people, but in the early modern period, I say that it's Romani people. You can think about the medieval response to Jewish people and the violent acts against Jewish people in England in the medieval period, which often was executions and also kind of mob mentality lynchings that happened, and that forming a kind of biopolitics in that period. But pushing it to thinking about the sovereign biopolitics of the early modern period starts with the figure of the gypsy and the treatment of early modern Romani people, and then spreads to ways in which people of color abroad were treated. Absolutely.
Thank you. There's loads to unpack there.
Yeah.
I want to pick up on kind of one of the last things you said there. Are you telling us then that there's a shift in the targets of oppression from Jewish populations in the medieval period to Romani populations in the early modern? Have I understood that right?
I think there's multiple timelines to consider. So in England, there absolutely is a shift because, one, they didn't think that there were any Jewish people in early modern England. There is a way in which we can kind of conceive that maybe there was, and Ashkenazi Jewish populations had the ability to pass versus Romani populations who were, often marked in literature and cultural documents through the brownness of their skin, not being able to pass. And so they become kind of a visible other within England. So those become why I think in England there's a shift, and there's also often a kind of comparison between the two. Thomas Dekker says that gypsies or moon men or Egyptians are more scattered than Jews, and more hated. So there's a comparison between the populations, but you also see that in medieval continental Europe, when you have both populations there being targeted simultaneously, and Geraldine Hang attends to the medieval treatment of Romani people in continental Europe. They hadn't reached England yet, but they were already in many different kingdoms and nations in the medieval period, often as slaves. So in Eastern Europe, particularly places like Romania, Romani people were kept as slaves. And so she attends to that, and the treatment of Romani people during the Crusades, the treatment of Romani people through multiple churches, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church. So she does a really great kind of overview of medieval Romani people in her book, which is called, I think, Inventions of Race. I think that's what it's called.
Thank you. We'll try to make sure we put a link to that for people to follow. So I'm going to try and summarize just a few of the things that you said, partly to help listeners, but also to give you the opportunity to correct me if I got it wrong. But it sounds like amongst the many things that you've just told us, I'm putting it in extremely impersonal terms here, but there's a tension between a world of migration and a developing world of state formation, and of trying to forge, if that's the right word, or insist on state sovereignty. But at the same time, you're telling us about whiteness as a form of sovereignty, and whiteness which produces itself, defines itself in terms of its rightful power, rightful in its own, as it asserts it, rightful power over people's locations and well-being, agency and lives. There's quite a history developing here, as you're telling us.
Yeah. I think that there's definitely a tension in what the archive produces for historians of race. whether that be literary historians of race or cultural historians of race or social historians of race, and the desire that many of us come to the archive with, right? I desired to see much more agency and subjectivity of Romani people when I first entered the archive. And instead, I was met with extreme actions of violence, which, as a Romani person myself, and many historians of race or literary scholars of race um, are people of color too. So going into the archive, we often have this desire to see versions of ourselves in the past. Not everybody, but many of us do talk about that. And then to be met with only actions of violence, we know that isn't the whole truth, right? It isn't, the archive doesn't show us a wide picture of how early modern Romani people lived, for example. I know because I'm Roma that I have dreams and aspirations and ideas, and the archive, the early modern archive, didn't pick those up. Instead, what we see is more akin to looking into a funhouse mirror. You see something that's supposed to be you, like a caricature, but it isn't you, right? And so for me to go into the archive and kind of think about, okay, well, I can't necessarily, at least with these documents that I found, there may be documents that show a more holistic picture of Romani people thriving versus being objects to act violently upon. But if I'm attending to these documents that are portraying these kinds of violent portrayals, then I can think critically about what the archive is doing, because I know that's not a reality, right? It's doing something strategic to form these living people into vessels that contain the desire, fears, and fantasies of the white English. And so that's really important for a lot of what we're doing, is not going into the archive and then just recovering and saying, well, here's what we found and this is the truth. It's really critically engaging and doing what Lisa Lowe calls is like attending to archival documents with hesitancy, right? So that to me has been really important in a kind of attention to early modern English race making and the documents that surround that.
Thank you. Yeah, I love the idea of attending to archives with hesitancy. And in your own work, you've put that as reading against the archive.
Yeah.
And looking for fragments of subjectivity, agency, and resistance. And you've acknowledged that those three things are often in themselves difficult and problematic to track down. But that idea, I think, particularly thinking about listeners to these videos who may be coming to the research world for the first time, you know, the perhaps the instinctive way to approach an archive is to listen to it, see what it says, and reflect it.
Right.
You were showing us the importance of absolutely not doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. It is a frustration because for some people, they may have an investment in saying the archive is the historical truth, and this is telling me something about the past, depending on what their project is. But for scholars of color working on early modern race, I think that's a hard pill to swallow, because the archive presents us with dehumanizing images of ourselves. And so we have to fight against that idea that the archive is the all-telling truth maker, right? And we have to think strategically then, if the archive is made by white people for a white audience to read, right? Because no Romani person wants to read these documents about themselves, right? They're not buying Thomas Decker's Lantern and Candlelight or Ben Jonson's The Gypsies Metamorphosed and being like, sitting down and being like, oh, this is our history, right? Nobody's doing that. White people are doing that. And so I have to think about, what is this doing for white people strategically then? If it's not telling the truth, what are the multiple strategies that are happening within these like literary and cultural documents that work towards a white national project and the formation of whiteness in early modern England?
Great, thank you. You've moved us on there from thinking about the archive now. And we've already, in these videos, talked a little bit with people like Stana Lipscomb about some of the challenges of archival absence and silence.
Yeah.
And not just in terms of ideology, but also in terms of just that not all life is verbal. Not all life ends up written down. I mean, I know that you yourself work with non-verbal sources, images in particular,
Mhm.
but it's so easy for historians and also people who use the work of historians, I think, to start getting very wordy in the way they think about the past. But you're now pushing us to thinking about how some of the things we think of as historical, how they were used in their own time. And you referred earlier to the issue of fiction and realities. I think I'm quoting you from earlier, fiction and realities. And given this video series interest in literature, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about, these fictions that are being produced, and as you just said, how they're being used.
Yeah. So we could start with Shakespeare, or we could not. I'm deferring to you because
You're in charge of this video. It's your content.
okay. So I work a lot with Shakespeare in my work, not just as the large literary figure he is in the early modern period, but as the large cultural capital that he is. I think it's really important for race scholars to keep attending to Shakespeare because he still speaks to whiteness in the present, just as he speaks to whiteness in the past. So a lot of my work is thinking through Shakespeare, but not just Shakespeare. I work with Ben Jonson's Masks, Thomas Dekker, Thomas Middleton, John Ford, Rowley. There's so many different playwrights who are invested in the figure of the gypsy or racialized figures more generally that I think are really compelling. Those are just some. Oh, Aphra Behn. Aphra Behn has a lot of gypsies in her drama. So there's also women writers who are invested in thinking through racialized images, often for their own capital and identity gains, right? Thinking about the identity of whiteness and what they have to gain from that. So some of the texts that I tend to are often not read. I mean, the Gypsy's Metamorphosis is an easy one to enter into because that one's just about gypsies. And it was a mask. So, it was performed in court for the sovereign, with the sovereign. So King James was a participant in the mask, along with the Duke of Buckingham and other courtiers. So you have a participation of the people making these kinds of sovereign and legislation decisions that hurt Romani people, and then having this kind of farce of, in the end of the mask, the gypsies turn white. And so you have this idea that the sovereign, the benevolent sovereign, King James, could have the power and would turn Romani people white, giving them white status, and so that they wouldn't be subject to any of the violence that Romani people were subject to. And so there's an interesting thing going on there. But I also work with plays like Othello and the Egyptian Charmer in Othello, reading the Egyptian Charmer as a gypsy figure through the associations with Egypt and Egyptian with gypsy being kind of a corruption of the word Egyptian. And we think,
do you mind telling us who the Egyptian sorcerer is, just someone who doesn't know?
Yeah, the Egyptian Charmer is the supposed one of the origin tales of the handkerchief in Othello. So he only tells Desdemona this story. He tells another story to other people. So there's two different handkerchief origin stories. I focus more on the Egyptian Charmer one and kind of unpacking how the Egyptian Charmer, read as a gypsy figure, serves as a catalyst, that those narratives of race and gypsiness serve as a catalyst for the rest of the play. The handkerchief is then imbued with associations of wantonness, like gypsies, and hypersexualization and infidelity that were associated with Romani women. So, but also thinking that chapter of my book project also looks at race and how clothing becomes a technology of race making more broadly. So I do a lot of work with costume books with my readings of Othello. We have Othello, we have Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra's called a gypsy multiple times in the text. There's mentions of gypsies and As You Like It and the Midsummer Night's Dream. Gypsies are everywhere in early modern England. I didn't realize that when I first started this project, though.
Yeah. And the costume books you mentioned, those are costume books from the period?
Yes, many of them are Italian, but they were often circulated in the period. And then there's just prints and drawings that portray Romani people in various clothings that I attend to, like that were traveling, like Jacques Collot. I write a lot about Jacques Collot's prints and drawings that were circulating in England in the period.
Thank you so much. That's all really clear and helpful, and I'm excited to see what people make of that, the conversation we've had, because I think a lot of this will be very new, and you've explained it beautifully. And hopefully, maybe sometime we could revisit this conversation in the future.
Yeah.
I think there's so much more to unpack here. We're sort of heading towards the end of our time together now, though. I can't stop thinking about the handkerchief and how one of the medical pieces of advice in the current situation in the UK is about sneezing and where one should sneeze. And suddenly Othello feels like a very of now kind of a play, even though that really is not what the handkerchief is used for in Othello. But anyway, we're ending these videos by asking people to tell us whether the word literature has value to them, if it's a useful word or it's not a useful word. Is it a good word, an unhelpful word? So would you mind, just telling us what that word means to you, how you might use it yourself?
I find literature a tumultuous word, I guess, because like most scholars of literature, we start with like a love of literature, and then we start attending to literature as a tool. And so I keep two separate worlds when it comes to literature. I read, poets of color for pleasure, and I don't think of that as much of a tool in my work, as much as I do think of it as like a breath of fresh air when I have to attend to literature as cultural documents, as productions and reproductions of racism. So there often is a split for me in what I want to read to thrive and what I want to read to understand how I can create a world in which we thrive. Because I do believe that attending to these, there's always a violence in attend to yourself when you attend to archival literary documents that portray you in dehumanized ways, right? There's always a way in which you come from that, losing a little bit of yourself every time. But I have to believe that I'm doing it for a purpose, right? And so literature, attending to as a tool of racism and then repurposing it as a tool for understanding how racism was formed, and then maybe through that understanding how we can abolish the system so that all of us can thrive. And so for me, the idea of literature as this tumultuous tool has always been kind of at the forefront of the work that I do.
Thank you. That's really rich and exciting. I hope I'm not turning what the very moving and important thing you just said and giving it a sort of a needlessly Disney happy ending. But would it be right to say that in losing yourself each time you revisit some of this troubling archive, there is also a project to be rebuilding, perhaps not yourself, but to be rebuilding a better community now?
I have to believe that. I wouldn't do the work that I did if I didn't think that there was going to be some benefit to people, whether that be our students who have grappled with this literature by themselves and then realize that there's this whole school of people, from Kim Hall to Joyce McDonald to Ayanna Thompson to Anya Lumba, and younger scholars too, continuing this work, who have made it their mission to fight against those stereotypes being kind of treated as fact in the classroom, and have this new way of reading it that is empowering to students of color. That to me keeps me continuing the work that I do.
Thank you so much. We recently posted videos by Brandy Adams, who
She's
gave
great.
a series of shout outs for race scholars, and also a video with Travis Lau, who was talking about the importance of collaborative community building. And you are yourself now helping us to think about who that community might be, and adding to our wish list of people we hope to speak to one day in these films.
Yeah.
So, just very briefly then, finally, you mentioned a book you're working on. Would you like to tell us a bit more about what that book is?
It's called Outlandish People, Gypsies, Race, and Fantasies of National Identity in Early Modern England. So I am attending to the multitude of technologies of race making in early modern England through the figure of the gypsy, and connecting it not just to the violence of the past or the early modern past, but also contemporary violences from the Romani Holocaust victims, and the formation of Holocaust ideologies, because I do think that there is a through line from sovereign biopolitics to the biopolitics of the Holocaust, and more contemporary anti-Romani legislation and nationalism that has recently cropped up in the last 10 years.
Thank you. Very important work, especially at our own historical moment.
No, there's a lot of Brexit I've been thinking about lately. So
yeah, let's not start talking about that because we'll never stop. Sydnee, it's a joy and a pleasure to speak to you always. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Andy.
And I hope to talk soon. Have a good rest of the day.
You too. Bye.